continue with the 42nd chapter of the book of Yirmiyahu. We're in the middle of the story later in the story of the killing of Gedaliah by Yishmael. We talked about the similarities to the sale of Yosef yesterday. And Yochanan, who was the one who warned Gedaliah, has come with the army, and they have gotten many people who Gedaliah and his band of criminals had kidnapped. They now have them with them. And thus that's where we continue. So all of the army officers, led by Yochanan and Yazania and all the rest of the people, great and small, what did they do? They approached. Doesn't say who they approached, but now we'll see in verse 2. Vayomru el Yirmiyahu hanavi. I pointed out yesterday that Yirmiyahu has been absent from these chapters after Nebuzaradan released him, and Yirmiyahu said, I'm going to stay here with my people. I'm not going to go back to Bavel under your protection. I'm going to stay here. And we didn't hear from him in that whole episode about the killing of Gedaliah. Now, in the aftermath, the people come to Yirmiyahu. Hanavi, tipona tchinatenu lefanecha et baalel ba'adenu el Adonai Elohecha ba'ad kol asher itazo ki nisharnu ma'at meharbe kasher einecha ra'ot otanu. They ask Yirmiyahu to pray for them, the remnant, the little bit that's left. We know, of course, that in past chapters, we saw two different chapters where Tzidkiyahu asked Yirmiyahu to pray for him, and Yirmiyahu refused. And God said to Yirmiyahu, even in the first time around, God said to Yirmiyahu, even if Moshe or Shmuel appeared, I would not listen to their prayers. Don't pray for them. They are rotten to the core. And they continue, Vayaged lanu et Adonai Elohecha et haderech asher nelech ba v'et hadavar asher naseh. Let God tell us what we should do, where we should go. Vayomer alehem Yirmiyahu navi shamati. Hineni mitpalel Adonai Elohechem kedabrechem. Vayakol hadavar asher aneh Adonai etchem agid lachem lo emna mikem davar. Yirmiyahu says, I hear your request, and I will do as you speak. And as he said many times, even though people don't want to hear what he has to say, I will not withhold anything from you. Vehema amru el Yirmiyahu yihi Adonai banu la'ed emet v'ne'eman. And they said, let God be the witness. We swear that we will do exactly what God tells us. Im tov v'im ra. Whether God tells us something that we want or we don't want. B'kol Adonai Eloheinu asher anachnu sholchim otcha elav nishma leman asher yitav lanu ki nishma b'kol Adonai Eloheinu. So we don't care what God, if it's something that we want to do, something we agree with, something we disagree with. It's not like the past where you told us to submit to Bavel and we didn't. We will do exactly what God tells us. We will obey the eternal God. Vahi mikate, we're in verse 7, aseret yamim, vahi devar Adonai Yirmiyahu. It was 10 days later that the word of God reaches Yirmiyahu. And this is sort of interesting. Does this mean that Yirmiyahu waits a few days before he goes and asks God? He says he'll pray for them, but he's in no rush. Is his prayers and questions to God no longer as enthusiastic? It's not clear why it takes 10 days, but that's what we are told. And certainly if you contrast the idea of Moshe, Moshe would just ask God, and God would answer Moshe right away. Verse 8, so he calls all the people. This is the word of God who you sent me to request and ask. If you remain in this land, I will build, and it will not overthrow. I will plant, and it will not uproot, for I regret the punishment that I have brought upon you. Right? This week's parsha is Parsha Noach. God says just the opposite. God is nichamti, that he created man. I regret that I created man, is what God says around the time before the flood. Here he says, I regret the punishment that I've given to you. And Yirmiyahu continues, Al tiru mipnei melech Bavel asher atem yireim mipanav al tiru menenu ma'adonai ki etchem ani lo she'etchem latzil etchem miyado. Don't be scared of the king of Babylon. I understand why you're scared. It's almost impossible not to be scared after the past history and after the killing of his installed governor and the soldiers who were there with him. God says, don't worry, because I am here to protect and to save you. I will dispose, I'll be merciful, and you will return to your land. But if you say, we're not going to stay here, we'll disobey God, it's nothing new. Le'mor lo keretz Mitzrayim navo asher lo nireh milchama v'kol shofar lo nishma v'lalechem lo lirav v'sham neishev. We'll go to Egypt because in Egypt there's no war. Yirmiyahu, right? The Yirmiyahu, the people understand that right now Egypt and Bavel are not battling, are not fighting, and they don't know war over there. And we'll find a protective place, and it's not a place of hunger because of the Jordan River. Yata lachein shemu dvar Adonai sherit Yehuda. Kol amar Adonai tzvot Elokei Yisrael. Imatem som tisimun pneichem levo Mitzrayim vatem lagur sham. If you follow the words that you are saying and you go to Egypt and you go there to dwell, vayta cher vasher atem yirayim mimena sham tasigetchem be'eretz Mitzrayim. Varav asher atem doagim mimenu sham yidbak acharechem Mitzrayim v'sham tamutu. Stay in this land, you'll be secure. Go to Egypt and all of the things that you fear, the Babylonian army, a potential famine, a plague, whatever it might be, it will follow you and it will davek. It will stick to you. Devek, the word in modern Hebrew for glue, it will stick to you. There's going to be nobody left if you go to Egypt. There's going to be no remnant whatsoever. All the things that God had said to the Jews, if they go down to, if they didn't submit to Bavel, that they're going to be an embarrassment and they're going to be, God's anger and wrath will pour upon them. That's what's going to happen to you if you go to Egypt, and you will never return here. Diber Adonai lechem sherit Yehuda. Al tavo Mitzrayim. So Yirmiyahu now repeats, seemingly right before this was all God's prophecy, and now he's saying, you hear that God has spoken to you, you remnant of Yehuda, don't go to Egypt. Yadoa tedu ki ha'idodati bachem hayom. You surely should know that I have warned you on this day. And that language is very interesting, where it says Yada Tedu, because that is like the words that God uses with Avraham by the Brit Bein Abitarim. When God says to Avram, Yadoa Teda, exact same language. It's to an individual. It's to Avram as opposed to here. It is to the plural, so it's in the plural. Yadoa Tedu, Yadoa Teda, Ki ger yeh zarachem be'eretz lo lahem. That's what God says to Avram. Your family will be, your descendants will be strangers in a land that they do not know. And God, of course, tells them they will be afflicted, etc., etc. The difference there is, of course, God promises in the end that his people, the descendants of Avraham, will come back. Here, Yirmiyahu has spoken the word of God that they will not come back. We're in 20. So you were deceitful, he says to them. Makes it sound like they've already made a decision. We don't know if that's the case. When you told me to ask God, when you told me to pray to God, and you'll do whatever God tells us. I told you today, and you're not obeying the eternal God that I was sent to tell you. Again, he says the words, Yadoa tedu, ki b'cherev barav uvadever tamutu b'makom asher chafatztem lavo lagursham. Just know that you will die by the sword, by famine, by plague in the place where you want to go. And so Yirmiyahu believes that they've already made a decision. They're going to go back to Egypt. Egypt's a bad place. The Torah tells you can't go back to Egypt. The idea of going back, it's like the idea of Yetziat Mitzrayim hasn't happened. It's going in the wrong direction. God takes the Jewish people out of Egypt. Going back to Egypt is seen as a prohibition. Egypt is a place of idolatry. Egypt is a place where they rely upon the river rather upon God. And thus, Jews, if you go there, that's the final stage in the coffin for you. If you go back there, that's going to be the end of who you were. And what's their decision? Seemingly what Yirmiyahu is saying to them is they've sort of already made up their mind. And he calls them insincere, and that's a nicer word to use than maybe the other words that we could use. They are insincere in their asking Yirmiyahu to pray to God, and in their statements that they will listen to anything that God tells them. From Yirmiyahu, it appears that they won't, and we'll continue this tale tomorrow and see what their response and answer and direction of where they want to go comes, and we'll see that tomorrow.